A solemn journey through the American heartland's most violent history, tracing the evolution of the tornado from a mythical, silent killer of the 1920s to the radar-tracked monsters of the modern age, and the resilient communities that stood their ground. Whispers in the Wheat explores the terrified awe and devastating power of the deadliest tornadoes in U.S. history. We begin in the pre-radar era, where storms struck without warning, decimating the innocent boom towns of the Roaring Twenties. We move through the Great Depression, where nature kicked America while it was down, and into the technological revolution of the 1950s and 70s that changed how we watch the sky. This is not just a catalog of destruction. It is a portrait of the American spirit, the farmers, shopkeepers, and families who crawled out of the rubble to rebuild on the same foundations, forging an identity defined by the horizon. If you stand in the middle of a wheat field in southern Illinois, or on a dusty porch in the Texas Panhandle, you learn to listen to the silence. It's a heavy, humid silence, the kind that sticks to your shirt. Go back to March 18th, 1925, a Wednesday. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing, but out here, far from the jazz clubs of Chicago or New York, the rhythm was set by the planting season. It was an unusually warm day, the kind of day where you'd roll up your sleeves and think about how early the spring had come. There were no weather satellites looking down, no warning systems, just a barometer on the wall dropping like a stone, and a strange, bruised color taking over the horizon. A shade of green that nature doesn't usually paint with. When the wind came that day, it didn't look like the tornadoes you see in the movies. It wasn't a tight, polite funnel dancing in the distance. It was a fog, a rolling, boiling wall of black smoke and debris that touched the ground and stayed there for 3.5 hours. It was a monster that didn't just visit, it traveled. 219 miles. When the dust settled, nearly 700 Americans were gone. Towns were erased off the map, leaving nothing but foundations and memories. It was the moment the heartland realized that the very land that fed them could also consume them. This is the story of that violence. But more importantly, it's the story of the people who looked that darkness in the eye, buried their dead, picked up a hammer, and started over. If you stand long enough in the middle of a winter wheat field in southern Illinois, or lean against a fence post on a dusty porch in the Texas Panhandle, you learn to listen to the silence. It's not an empty silence. It's heavy, humid, the kind of silence that sticks to your shirt and presses against your eardrums. It's the atmosphere holding its breath. In the modern world, we think we've tamed the unknown. We have sirens that wail across the county lines. We have applications on our smartphones that scream at us hours before a cloud even begins to rotate. We have Doppler radar painting the atmosphere in bright, angry reds and violets, tracking rotation down to the street level. We think we have control. Or at least, we comfort ourselves with the idea of notice. But to understand the scar tissue on the American heartland, you have to imagine a time when the sky kept its secrets. Go back to March 18th, 1925, a Wednesday. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing in the cities, fueled by jazz and cheap credit. But out here, far from the bright lights of Chicago or New York, the rhythm was set by the planting season. It was an unusually warm day for March. The kind of day where a farmer would roll up his sleeves, wipe his brow, and marvel at an early spring. There were no weather satellites looking down, no warning systems. In fact, the U.S. Weather Bureau had explicitly banned the word tornado from forecasts, fearing it would cause undue panic. So there was just a barometer on the farmhouse wall dropping like a stone, and a strange, bruised color taking over the horizon. A shade of green that nature doesn't usually paint with. When the wind came that day, it didn't look like the tornadoes you see in Hollywood movies. It wasn't a tight, polite funnel dancing in the distance. It was a fog, a rolling, boiling wall of black smoke and debris that touched the ground and stayed there for 3.5 hours. It was a monster that didn't just visit, it traveled. 219 miles across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. When the dust finally settled, nearly 700 Americans were gone. Entire towns, places like Gorham and Griffin, were erased off the map, leaving nothing but splintered wood and foundations. It was the moment the heartland realized that the very land that fed them could also consume them. This documentary is the story of that violence, but more importantly, it's the story of the people who looked that darkness in the eye, buried their dead, picked up a hammer, and started over on the exact same plot of land. To understand why the American story is so violently intertwined with the wind, you have to look at the map. You have to strip away the interstates, the strip malls, and the center pivot irrigation circles, and look at the bones of the continent. Nowhere else on Earth is built quite like North America. It is a geographical accident designed to manufacture violence. To the west, you have the massive wall of the Rocky Mountains, drying out the air and sending it rushing east. To the south, you have the Gulf of Mexico, a bathtub of warm, humid soup pumping moisture north. And in the middle, you have the Great Plains, a flat, unobstructed dinner table where these two volatile guests are forced to sit together. When the cool, dry air from the mountains crashes into that hot, sticky air from the Gulf, it doesn't just mix, it explodes. It creates an atmospheric engine, the supercell, that exists almost exclusively in the American Midwest. When European settlers first pushed past the Mississippi under the Homestead Act, they were walking into a trap they couldn't comprehend. They came from Germany, England, and Ireland, places where rain was just rain and wind was just a nuisance. They had no vocabulary for a sky that could reach down and scrub a homestead off the face of the earth. In the late 1880s, a man named John Park Finley, a sergeant in the U.S. Army Signal Corps, tried to give them that vocabulary. He was the first true storm chaser, long before the Dodge Rams and the GoPros. Finley set up a network of tornado reporters across the plains, local postmasters and railroad agents who would telegraph warnings down the line. He studied the patterns. He realized that the wind followed rules. Finley actually achieved remarkable accuracy. He could predict the conditions for a tornado with 95% success. But in a twist of bureaucratic irony that feels all too familiar today, his superiors shut him down. The logic was cold and simple. The government believed that the panic caused by the word tornado would cost more money than the lives the warnings might save. So, the word was banned. The ban stuck for decades. The Signal Corps recalled Finley's books. The telegraph lines fell silent on the matter, and the settlers were left with nothing but folklore. They learned to read the sky like a cryptic text. They looked for the greenage, that sickly tint in the clouds. They listened for the sound of a freight train where there were no tracks. They built root cellars and prayed that the geography of fate wouldn't choose their particular patch of dirt. If the late 19th century was the era of the pioneer squinting at the horizon, the early 20th century was the era of the builder who thought he had conquered it. By the 1920s, the Great Plains in the Midwest weren't just isolated homesteads anymore. They were the engine room of America. We were drilling for oil in Oklahoma, mining coal in Illinois, and manufacturing the furniture of the middle class in Indiana. We were laying down the infrastructure of permanence, brick schoolhouses, steel truss bridges, and downtown districts lined with plate glass. We felt secure in our masonry. We had the Model T and the radio. We had the arrogance of the industrial age. But the atmosphere didn't care about our zoning laws or our county lines. That arrogance was shattered on March 18, 1925. It was a Wednesday. The weather maps in Washington, D.C. showed a low-pressure system, but thanks to that standing ban on the word tornado, the forecast for the Midwest simply read, rains and strong shifting winds. What actually touched down near Ellington, Missouri, shortly after 1 p.m., was a monstrosity that defied physics. This wasn't the slender, rope-like funnel you see in The Wizard of Oz. This was a wedge, a grinding wall of black fog dragging the ground, moving forward at a terrifying 73 miles per hour. It stayed on the ground for 3.5 hours. It tore through 3 states, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana. It didn't lift, it didn't cycle, it just fed. In the town of Murfreesboro, Illinois, it arrived right as the shifts were changing at the Mobile and Ohio railroad shops. Survivors later said they didn't even see a funnel. They just saw the sky come down to the earth. It pulverized the brick buildings as easily as the sod houses of the previous generation. In minutes, 234 people in that single town were dead. This was the tri-state tornado. To this day, it remains the single deadliest tornado in U.S. history, claiming 695 lives. But the tragedy wasn't just the wind speed, it was the silence. Because the telegraph lines were severed early in the storm's path, the towns down the line had no idea what was coming. They were going about their Tuesday afternoon, buying groceries and sitting in classrooms, while a mile-wide grinder headed their way. The rise of the American tornado wasn't about the storms getting stronger. It was about us getting denser. We had packed ourselves into the bowling alley, turned off the lights, and told ourselves the thunder was just noise. Fast forward a generation. The 1920s silence was gone, replaced by a sound that became the soundtrack of the American Midwest in the Cold War era. You know the sound. It was the mechanical wail of a federal thunderbolt siren atop a telephone pole. Originally installed to warn us about Soviet bombers, by the 1950s and 60s, they had found a new purpose. When that yellow horn started to rotate, you didn't duck and cover for the bomb. You grabbed a flashlight in the AM radio, and you headed for the cellar. This was the golden age of the tornado watch. It was a sensory experience etched into the childhood of every baby boomer from Nebraska to Alabama. It was the smell of ozone and wet asphalt. It was the sky turning a bruised, sickly shade of green that didn't seem natural. It was the static on the Philco television set when the lightning struck too close. And it all culminated in the single most violent 24 hours in recorded weather history. The super outbreak of April 3rd and 4th, 1974. If the tri-state tornado was a sniper, the super outbreak was a carpet bombing. Over a span of just 18 hours, 148 tornadoes touched down across 13 states. It wasn't just one storm system, it was a continental convulsion. At one point, there were 15 separate tornadoes on the ground simultaneously. The epicenter of the nightmare was Xenia, Ohio. Xenia wasn't a lonely pioneer outpost. It was a thriving, modern city of 25,000 people. It had strip malls, fast food joints, and brick ranch houses. It was the picture of the American dream until 4:40 p.m. That's when an F5 monster, a half-mile wide, chewed through the town. It tossed school buses onto the roofs of bowling alleys. It took the Xenia Hotel and turned it into a pile of matchsticks. But unlike 1925, the world was watching. We had local news anchors in plaid blazers drawing on plastic maps with greased pencils, their voices cracking as they realized the radar scope was lighting up like a Christmas tree. We had the newly implemented emergency broadcast system interrupting the Mike Douglas show with that long, jagged tone. For the first time, the tornado wasn't just a rumor from the next county, it was in the living room. We saw the footage of the funnel moving through Xenia, captured on 8mm home movie cameras. It looked like a living thing, a dark, debris-filled blender erasing the grid of civilization. By the time the sun rose on April 5th, over 300 people were dead and 5,000 were injured. The sheer volume of the violence forced us to realize that our post-war suburban sprawl had just placed more targets in the shooting gallery than ever before. To understand why the storms of the late 20th century felt so much more personal and so much more destructive, you have to look away from the clouds for a moment and look at the ground. You have to look at the map, not the weather map, but the road map. In the decades following World War II, America underwent a migration that fundamentally changed the math of disaster. We left the crowded brick tenements of the cities and the sturdy timber farmhouses of the deep country. We moved to the middle ground. We moved to the suburbs. We paved over the wheat fields of Kansas and the oak forests of Alabama to build the great American subdivision. We constructed a new kind of life based on the quarter-acre lot, the two-car garage, and the split-level ranch home. And here lies the cruel irony of that era. The very architecture of the American dream was uniquely vulnerable to the American nightmare. These new houses were built for speed and affordability, framed with light pine 2x4s and sheathed in drywall. They were open, airy, and modern. But against a 3-second gust of 200-mile-per-hour wind, a suburban ranch house offers about as much resistance as a house of cards. Simultaneously, we saw the rise of the mobile home. It was an affordable path to home ownership for millions, but in the path of a supercell, it became a death trap. The statistics began to skew. You were no longer looking at a farmer caught in the field. You were looking at entire neighborhoods, entire zip codes erased in minutes because the population density in Tornado Alley had doubled. But the social context wasn't just about where we lived. It was about how we watched. By the 1970s, the tornado had ceased to be a local legend passed down by elders. It became a mass media event. The technology of the Cold War, radar originally designed to track Soviet bombers, was turned toward the sky to track rotation. The weatherman became a local celebrity, a trusted figure in a polyester suit who held your life in his hands. We developed a strange, collective ritual. We sat in our carpeted living rooms, bathed in the blue glow of the television, watching the radar sweep, waiting for the anchor to say our county's name. It was a shared anxiety. The storm was no longer a monster in the dark. It was a green blob on a screen, heading right for the new shopping mall on the edge of town. We had conquered the frontier, or so we thought. We had air conditioning and interstate highways, but the super outbreak and the storms that followed taught us a humbling lesson. You can pave the prairie, but you cannot tame the sky. If the suburbs were where we tried to hide from the weather, Norman, Oklahoma, is where we decided to fight back. By the late 1970s, a transformation was taking place in the heart of the Great Plains. It was a shift from passive observation to active pursuit. Until this moment, a tornado warning was essentially an obituary written in real time. By the time a spotter saw the funnel and called it in, the damage was often already done. The warning lead time was 0. But inside a series of nondescript government buildings, a group of meteorologists and engineers were tinkering with a technology that would strip the sky of its secrets. They called it Doppler. It was a concept borrowed from physics, the same principle that explains why a train whistle drops in pitch as it passes you. But instead of sound, these scientists were bouncing radio waves off raindrops. Suddenly, the radar screen wasn't just showing us where the storm was, it was showing us how the storm was moving. For the first time, we saw the colors of the wind, green for inbound, red for outbound. When those two colors rubbed together on the screen, known as the couple, we knew the monster was breathing long before it ever touched the ground. But technology has limits. A radar beam shoots in a straight line, and the Earth is curved. The further out you look, the higher you are scanning. To know what was happening in the mud, in the dirt, you needed eyes on the ground. This gave rise to a uniquely American subculture, the storm chaser. Forget the Hollywood blockbusters and the energy drink sponsorships of today. The pioneers of this transformation were university researchers and graduate students in rusted-out station wagons. They hauled heavy 16mm film cameras and drove cars rigged with homemade weather vanes and ham radios. They turned the highway system into a laboratory. They ate at gas stations, slept in roadside motels, and drove thousands of miles for 30 seconds of data. They weren't adrenaline junkies. They were cartographers of chaos. They wanted to understand the thermodynamics of the supercell, to figure out why one storm fizzles out and another levels a town. Because of them, the lead time for a warning stretched, first to 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. It felt like a victory. It felt like science was finally taming the frontier. We began to believe that if we could just see it coming, we could outsmart it. While the scientists were busy sharpening their eyes in the sky, the rest of America was busy changing the ground. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the American dream was undergoing a renovation. We stopped building for the worst-case scenario and started building for the best-case economy. The sturdy, drafty farmhouses of the early 20th century, homes often built by the people who lived in them, anchored by deep root cellars and heavy timber, were disappearing. In their place, the subdivision arose. We sprawled outward, turning thousands of acres of wheat fields and scrubland into cul-de-sacs and strip malls. We paved the tornado alley. By expanding the footprint of our cities, we were simply making the dartboard bigger. Statistically, a tornado used to have a hard time hitting anything expensive in Kansas. Now it was hard for one not to. But it wasn't just where we built, it was how we built. To keep costs down and square footage up, the root cellar was value engineered out of existence. It was replaced by the concrete slab foundation. We traded safety for an extra bathroom and a 2-car garage. We put our faith in particle board, vinyl siding, and sheetrock, materials that disintegrate the moment wind speeds cross the threshold of a Category 3 hurricane, let alone an EF5 tornado. And for those locked out of the housing boom, the situation was even more dire. The manufactured home became the primary affordable housing option in the rural South and Midwest. These structures, sitting on blocks rather than anchored to the earth, became the tragic hallmark of modern tornado fatality statistics. Then there was the psychological erosion, the boy who cried wolf syndrome. As warnings became more frequent, they became background noise. The siren, once a terrifying call to action, became a nuisance interrupting the football game. We developed a fatal complacency. We started trusting the technology too much, assuming that if the TV weatherman wasn't screaming, we were safe. We watched storms on television like reality shows, divorced from the violence of the wind. The bill for this complacency came due on May 3, 1999. When a mile-wide grinder dropped onto the suburbs of Oklahoma City, it didn't matter that the warning lead time was excellent. It didn't matter that the meteorologists were heroes. The tornado chewed through the subdivisions of Moore like a lawnmower through tall grass. It registered wind speeds of 301 miles per hour, the highest ever recorded on the face of the planet. We learned a hard lesson that day. A 15-minute warning is useless if you have nowhere to go. If the late 90s were defined by complacency, the spring of 2011 was the year America got punched squarely in the mouth. The prediction from the end of the last century came true with terrifying precision. The storms stopped playing by the rules of the open prairie. They moved into the deep forests of Alabama, the hills of Tennessee, and the dense city grids of Missouri. The super outbreak of April 2011 saw over 300 tornadoes touch down in just 4 days. Then barely a month later, Joplin happened. But in the wake of that splintered wood and twisted steel, something remarkable happened. We stopped waiting for the government to save us, and we started digging in. A quiet revolution began in the hardware stores and the zoning meetings of the American heartland. We finally admitted that the "it won't happen to me" mentality was a lie. The architectural amnesia of the suburban boom began to fade, replaced by a gritty, survivalist pragmatism. The status symbol of the new Midwest wasn't the granite countertop or the swimming pool anymore. It was the FEMA-certified safe room. We saw a massive retrofit of the American home. In garages across Oklahoma and basements in Illinois, contractors were busy bolting quarter-inch steel plates to concrete floors. We saw the return of the storm cellar, modernized with hydraulic doors and ventilation systems. Schools, once built like fragile glass palaces, were reimagined as fortresses. When Joplin rebuilt their high school, they didn't just build a gym, they built a bunker capable of withstanding 250-mile-per-hour winds. But the most profound adaptation wasn't in the concrete, it was in the character. A new kind of first responder emerged from the rubble. They didn't wear uniforms, and they didn't wait for orders. They were the chainsaw brigades, armies of neighbors in pickup trucks, armed with steels and Husqvarnas, clearing roads before the rain had even stopped. In Tuscaloosa and more, we saw the rise of a distinct social resilience. The survivor wasn't just a victim anymore. They were an active participant in their own rescue. We learned that when the grid goes down and the cell towers snap, the only thing that matters is the person living next door. We realized that while we couldn't engineer a windproof world, we could engineer a resilient community. We accepted that the sky would occasionally try to kill us, and we decided to be harder to kill. The fear didn't leave, but the helplessness did. We swept up the glass, we buried our dead, and we bolted our houses to the earth with a new, grim determination. Somewhere between the Kansas prairie of 1939 and the Oklahoma highways of the mid-90s, the tornado stopped being just a weather event. It became the great American monster movie. For generations, our understanding of the funnel was dictated by a sepia-toned nightmare. The Wizard of Oz taught us that the tornado was a portal, a terrifying, swirling void that ripped you from the safety of home and dropped you into the unknown. It was the ultimate symbol of displacement, the fear that the stability of the American family farm could be erased in a heartbeat. But as the century turned, the narrative shifted. We stopped hiding under the bed and started driving toward the clouds. The turning point was 1996. When Hollywood released Twister, it didn't just sell tickets, it rewired the cultural circuitry of the heartland. Suddenly, the meteorologist was the cowboy. The storm chaser was the rock star. The tornado wasn't just a tragedy anymore, it was the finger of God, a sublime, terrible beauty that demanded to be seen up close. We saw the birth of disaster tourism. A cottage industry sprang up along Interstate 35, vans bristling with antennas and radar domes, filled with tourists from New York and London, paying top dollar to stare down the barrel of a supercell. We commodified the adrenaline. We turned the deadliest force on the plains into a safari. Then came the digital shift. As cameras shrank from heavy, shoulder-mounted rigs to the smartphones in our pockets, the tornado went viral. Today, the cultural legacy of the storm is measured in clicks and views. We consume destruction in 15-second loops on social media. We watch barns explode and power lines arc from the safety of our office cubicles. There is a strange, voyeuristic detachment to it now. We marvel at the high-definition violence of the wind, sometimes forgetting that the debris ball on the screen is made of someone's living room, someone's photo albums, someone's life. Yet beneath the pop culture spectacle, a deeper, phantom scar remains. Ask anyone who grew up in the alley. The sound of a siren isn't a sound effect, it's a trigger. It bypasses the brain and hits the nervous system. The legacy isn't just in the movies we make, it's in the collective nightmare we share. We have mythologized the wind because if we turn it into a story, if we turn it into a movie monster, maybe it becomes something we can finally defeat. If you opened a science textbook in 1980, the map was simple. There was a big red oval stamped right over the heart of the continent: Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. We called it Tornado Alley. It was the designated arena where warm Gulf moisture met cold Canadian air, and we watched the battle play out over miles of flat, open wheat. But the atmosphere doesn't care about our maps, and in the modern era, the arena has moved. Meteorologists call it the shift. The statistical bullseye is sliding east, away from the dry lines of the plains and into the humid, tree-choked hills of the Deep South. We are talking about Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky. This is Dixie Alley, and it is a far deadlier beast. Out on the plains, you could see the storm coming for 20 miles. It was a black contrast against a gray sky. But here in the South, the storms are rain-wrapped. They are hidden behind curtains of falling water and walls of pine forest. And they like to come at night. This is the modern paradox. Technologically, we are gods. We have dual polarization radar that can detect the difference between a raindrop and a 2x4 floating 20,000 feet in the air. We have sirens that can pinpoint a specific neighborhood. The average lead time, the warning before the hit, has jumped from nearly 0 in the 1970s to 13, sometimes 15 minutes. But all the technology in the world can't fix infrastructure. In the modern South, the tornado hunts the vulnerable. It finds mobile home parks where there are no basements. It finds factories operating on a 24-hour shift in December. Look at Mayfield, Kentucky in 2021. A quad-state monster ripping through the dark in the middle of winter. That wasn't supposed to happen. The season used to be April and May. Now the calendar is just paper. The warming Gulf of Mexico is pumping fuel into the engine year-round. We are living in an age of hyper-awareness, but curiously fragile safety. We watch the radar loop on our phones, mesmerizing swirls of red and green, tracking the rotation street by street. We know exactly when it's coming. We just don't always know where to hide. It is the question every outsider asks when the cameras leave and the dust settles. When they see the aerial shots of Joplin, or Moore, or Xenia, whole grids of civilization turned into matchsticks, they ask, why do you stay? Why plant your roots in the middle of a bowling alley? To understand the tornado is to understand something fundamental about the American character. There is a distinct hubris to our history. We crossed the oceans, we cleared the forests, we dammed the mighty rivers, and we paved over the wilderness. We convinced ourselves that we had tamed the continent, that we could engineer our way out of any problem. But the tornado is the one thing we cannot tame. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot build a wall high enough to stop it. It is the last untamed predator in the American wild. It serves as a violent, terrifying check on our ambition. A reminder that despite our interstates, our strip malls, and our subdivisions, we are merely tenants on this land. And our lease is month to month. And yet, the response to this violence is where the real story lies. It isn't fear, it's defiance. Walk through a town 3 days after an EF5 hits. You won't see people packing U-Hauls to flee. You will see them clearing the roads with their own pickup trucks. You will hear the sound of chainsaws and generators before the National Guard even arrives. There is a stubborn, pioneer resilience in the tornado belt. It's a refusal to be bullied by the atmosphere. We treat the weather like a bad hand of poker. We fold, we lose our chips, and then we buy back in. We pour fresh concrete over the scars. We frame new houses on the same foundations where the old ones were swept away. It is a gamble, certainly. But to the people of the heartland, the beauty of that endless, open sky is worth the terror it sometimes brings. We live in the shadow of the funnel because this is home. And in America, home is something you fight for, even when the enemy is the wind itself. In the end, the history of the American storm isn't written in barometric pressure readings or wind speed estimates. It isn't found in the NOAA archives or the twisted steel of a destroyed water tower. The true history is written in the silence that follows the roar. It is a silence that hangs over the memorial parks in Murfreesboro, Illinois. It echoes in the rebuilt town squares of Xenia, Ohio, and lingers in the phantom neighborhoods of Joplin, Missouri. These are the places where the map was erased and redrawn, but the memory remains fixed in the soil. The deadliest tornadoes of all time, the Tri-State, the Natchez, the St. Louis, they serve as the dark punctuation marks in our national narrative. They remind us that for all our technological prowess, for all our Doppler radar and lead time warnings, we are still small creatures living under a massive, volatile canopy. There is a specific kind of reverence you find in the plains and the South. It's a respect earned through loss. When the sky turns that bruised shade of green and the air goes still, we don't just check our phones. We feel a prickle on the back of our necks that goes back generations. We remember the stories of the grandfathers who held the cellar doors shut, and the mothers who shielded their children in bathtubs. We honor the dead not by living in fear, but by continuing to live at all. By planting the crops again, by rebuilding the church steeple a little higher this time, by sitting on the tailgate at dusk and admiring the very thunderstorms that could destroy us. Because that is the paradox of the heartland. The same atmosphere that brings the devastation also brings the rain that feeds the wheat. It brings the sunsets that set the prairie on fire with color. It is beautiful and it is terrible. So we keep our eyes on the horizon. We keep the weather radio on the nightstand, and we maintain our vigil. We understand that the wind will return, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. And when it does, we will be ready. We will weather it together, standing on this hard-fought ground, watching the clouds spin their ancient, violent dance. This is the price of admission for the great